Namaste, Om Namah Shivaya. My name is Thomas, and this is a video for Lighthouse Yoga and our YouTube channel. We're going to be talking about the Yoga Sutras today, and of course we're going to be reading from several different texts, but I thought I would give an introduction today because I was kind of jumping around to some different topics, different passages from the Yoga Sutras that were appealing to me, and I hope are valuable to you. I think they certainly are. But I thought we'd start at the very beginning today. So I'm going to read Sutras 1 through 15 from the first book. And if you don't know, the 4 books of the Yoga Sutras are divided into particular sections based on philosophy, based on practice, powers, and then the overall culmination of the teachings is the 4th book. So today we're going to be starting with Sutra 1, Book 1. And we'll take it from there. I'm going to be first reading from Meditation and Mantras. This is Swami Vishnu Devananda. This is his book. And this is the translation that he gives for the first 15. And then we'll read maybe 2 or 3, 13, 14, 15, maybe from each of the other books and translations. But Vishnu Devananda, he's going to be pretty similar to Swami Sachidananda, whose book I've got over here. So, Chapter 1, The Road to Samadhi. Now yoga is being explained. Yoga is restraining the activities of the mind. At that time, when the thought waves are stilled, the perceiver rests in his own true nature. When the mind is not concentrated, the perceiver identifies with its modifications. There are 5 types of thought waves, some of which are painful and some of which are not. The 5 kinds of thought waves are correct knowledge, erroneous understanding, verbal delusion, sleep, and memory. Direct perception, inference, and competent testimony are proofs of correct knowledge. Sutra 1-8. Erroneous understanding is a false conception of an idea or object whose real nature does not conform to that concept. Verbal delusion is caused by the identification with words that have no basis in reality. That mental modification, which encompasses an absence of any content in the mind, is called sleep. Memory is the retention of past experiences. Their control of the chitta vrittis, or the mental modifications, is brought about by practice and non-attachment. So this is 1:13. Abhyasa is the continuous effort towards firmly establishing the restraint of thought waves. Practice becomes firmly grounded on being continued over a long period of time without interruption and with sincere devotion. Finally, vairagya, or non-attachment, is that state of consciousness in which the cravings for objects, both seen and unseen, controlled through mastery of the will. And so this is what we're going to be talking about today, non-attachment. Called vairagya is that state of consciousness in which the cravings for objects, both seen and unseen, controlled through mastery of the will. So, let's look at some other translations before we go on and we break this down. Swami Sachidananda, what do you have to say for yourself? 1:15, Samadhi Pada, Path of Samadhi, Law of Samadhi. The consciousness of self-mastery in one who is free from craving from objects seen or heard about is non-attachment. So the consciousness of self-mastery in one who is free from craving from objects seen or heard about is non-attachment. We'll get to this in just a second because it's very, very different what he's saying. All right. Finally, non-attachment is the mastery of consciousness wherein one is free from craving objects of enjoyment, whether they have been perceived or imagined from promises in the scriptures. This is Mukunda Styles. Okay, non-attachment is the mastery of consciousness wherein one is free from craving objects of enjoyment, whether they have been perceived or imagined from promises in the scriptures. And we'll just read one more for good measure. This is Geshe Michael Rauch, Yoga Sutras, Ancient Wisdom for Yoga. Giving up your attachments consists of the decision to gain control over your craving for experiences seen or only heard of. So the nuance between what each one of these guys are saying, and I recognize they're all dudes. Giving up your attachments consists of the decision to gain control over your craving for experiences seen or only heard of. So the distinction is one is a practice and one is the state of being. So one of them are talking about, okay, you're supposed to practice non-attachment. So you recognize, okay, I have cravings for the chocolate cake or the cookies, and I want the cookies, I want the chocolate cake. I'm going to not be attached. I'm going to, in some ways, restrict myself from having those things. And, you know, you can call that repression in some senses, and we can get into that kind of a discussion. I'd be interested to know what you think about this idea of non-attachment, because we're always here discussing together, never trying to just throw a bunch of information at you and say, okay, this is how you need to think about it, this is how you have to accept it, or anything like that. But I hope that we can have a discussion, or at least, you know, think about some of these bigger topics. So this idea of non-attachment, you know, making that distinction between, okay, I'm denying myself or I'm repressing myself. I'm not allowed to have this or that because I'm not a good person. We don't want to get into any of that. Guilt motivations or fear motivations. We're not about that at all. What we are about is saying, okay, I have certain desires and I have certain motivations, and I expect certain things to happen based on my actions, and I'm going to let go of those expectations. I'm going to let go of those particular perceived or expected outcomes. And this is a kind of way of living that is, yes, it's a practice, but it's also a way to approach your moment-by-moment life. Right? How are you going to walk through the world? Right? It's not so easy. Right? Non-attachment is discerning between two extremes. Right? If I go that direction, right? If I go to repression, if I go to denial, self-denial, then I'm going, you know, on the path of the ascetic. Right? I'm Buddha, not eating, not drinking, meditating for 10 hours a day, not sleeping, right? Essentially not taking care of the physical vehicle, right? And then, you know, Buddha, when he was young, Buddha was supposedly, he was a king, right? He was born into the warrior class. He was, you know, destined to be the king of his kingdom. And he renounced his kingdom. He renounced that whole way of life, right? He even left his marriage. Some people take issue with that, but the story is, right, you can't go to one way, and then of course from kingship he went all the way to living with no possessions, no home, just, you know, begging for food every single day. And even then he stopped begging for food. He stopped eating altogether, and it wasn't until somebody came and brought him some food he started to eat, he started to regain some of his strength, and he started to realize that he had a purpose and he had something to live for in this world. And that was when he started his whole teaching, the whole part of his life that consisted, second half of his life consisted of teaching. And he wouldn't have been able to do that if he had just withered away, if he had just stayed in the super conscious state, let's say, right? He wouldn't have been able to come back and teach anybody anything. So we're all benefiting from his work, right? And he was benefiting from these texts, right? He was benefiting from this this thought structure, right? Whether they had the Yoga Sutras at that time, that's a whole other story, right? But these ideas, these understandings, these components, they come from and are sourced through the Vedas, which definitely influenced Buddha and all the Hindu peoples at that time, right? All the people that were living in the Indus Valley, and all the people that were practicing their spirituality, all the traditions from Tibet, right? These all come out of those source texts of the Vedas. So what we're dealing with here, right, is now a practice that we can approach in our daily lives, right? When something happens, we take a moment to breathe and give ourselves a little bit of space. And that little space, that small gap of just giving yourself a moment to breathe, observing without reacting, this is non-attachment. This is the practice of non-attachment, which is to allow yourself just a little bit of space before you have to react, before you have to do the next thing that's coming up, right? Even if that thing is very important, right? Very, very significant factor in your life. Let's say, right, your source of income is compromised, right? Your home is compromised, right? You have to take certain actions in the world to rectify the situation, but responding purely from the emotions, responding purely from any source of fear or any source of guilt, right? These are always going to interfere with what we could call right action, which is a kind of action that is in sync with the flow, right? Action that is loving, action that is compassionate, action that is understanding, right? Action that has also boundaries, right? That has a certain level of responsibility involved, right? I'm responsible for myself, you are responsible for yourself, right? How we can take care of each other is a whole other aspect of this, right? How we approach relationships through non-attachment. We approach relationships through non-attachment because it's actually the healthiest way to be with someone else, right? Is that if I'm attached to you, I have certain expectations that I need met. Some of those expectations are unrealistic, and because those expectations are unrealistic, I put a certain amount of pressure on you. You feel obligated, you feel that you have to behave a certain way, and you feel confined potentially. You feel that my behavior is then creating jealousy or conflict in the relationship, and that doesn't work out very well for anybody. So this concept of non-attachment is universally applicable, right? Whether it's to person-to-person relationships, relationships to work, relationships to home, right? We give ourselves the space so that what we can find is a little bit of room to find a different way to function. Right? Because I think we can all agree that the way that we function with attachment, right, is with expectation, with all these different pressures, with guilt complexes and power dynamics. Right? These are all based on this idea of expectation and attachment. So what we're trying to do is figure out different ways to behave that are going to produce different outcomes that are better for everyone. And again, so much of this comes from this understanding of not functioning with attachment. Now, the other concept that I'll mention before we cut this video off is that once you have practiced this for a long time or for a little while, you start to become non-attached. It doesn't become so much of a thing you have to practice all the time. Sometimes in extreme situations where tensions are really high, new situations you've never encountered and experienced before, you might have to remind yourself, okay, breathe, take the time, look at this, how can I find the space for non-attachment, how can I apply that tool of non-attachment to give myself a little bit of distance so that I can look at this from several perspectives, not just the one emotional perspective or the purely logical perspective, right? Just focusing on the reason doesn't serve us either, right? So again, finding that middle ground between the two extremes. And what we're looking at then is that, I start to function in a way that is non-attached, right? That the way that I move through the world is no longer with that attachment, with that need for my outcomes to be the ones that are always happening, right? And if something happens that is not of my choosing, then what I'm going to do is try to see how it fits, right? Try to see how it plays into the entire scenario as a whole. And hopefully that gives me a little bit of space, allows me to calm my nerves, allows me to breathe, and gives me that way through the situation that is most harmonious, right? And that I'm able to act then in that situation with poise, with grace, with love, with compassion, with empathy, right? All of these things that we hold as very strong and valuable virtues, I'm going to function in that way as often as I can. And somewhat paradoxically, it seems that non-attachment is going to be the way that we find our way through, right? Is by letting go, we actually find deeper relationships. So that's a lot, I think. I'd love to know what you think. Please share your comments in the section below. That's for that purpose. Try to provide some information that's useful. So I'd appreciate you giving me the feedback, and if there are other topics, if there are other things that you've come across in the teachings that you'd like to hear about, or have me find references for in the Yoga Sutras, things like that, I'd be very interested in sharing that with all of you. So thank you so much. Please like the video. Please subscribe to the channel. It really helps me when you do that. Also helps more people to see the video, and we can keep the conversation going. We can see how we can be more loving in our relationships throughout our lives. So thank you so much. Peace. Namaste.